Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on using attribute-based access controls to comply with export controls. First, let me go over some logistics for the webinar. We will be handling any questions during the webinar through the Zoom webinar question interface. You can start the tool by clicking on the Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar. Type in your questions and we will either try to answer them in the course of the webinar or we'll answer them at the end during the Q&A section of the webinar. Also, this webinar will be recorded and will be available online as soon as we have finished processing the recording. All of you who registered will receive an email notification with a link to the recording of the webinar. Simply click on the email link to review the webinar yourselves, or you can share the link with anyone that you think would find it useful. Okay, so today we are going to cover several areas of attribute-based access control. First, we'll talk about the challenges of electronic export controls and enforcing export controls. Second, we're going to talk about what exactly is attribute-based access control, or as it's referred to most commonly, ABAC, A-B-A-C. Then we'll talk about how attribute-based access controls can be used to enforce export controls. And then finally, we'll do some demos of use cases that show you how ABAC is implemented to use it for export control purposes. And then finally, we will have a Q&A session at the end where we will go through all of the questions that were raised during the webinar. Also, let me introduce those who are involved in the webinar today. I'm Dennis Andre. I'm Director of Professional Services here at Next Labs, and I've been working with our customers for quite a long time, implementing ABAC export control systems. I'm joined today by several of my Next Labs colleagues. Our first speaker will be Tony Burning, who's a Senior Product Manager here at Next Labs. Tony will be going over the content of our webinar today. Then he'll hand it over to Charles Rice, who will be demoing some use case examples. And finally, we will be joined by Pratap Sakala and Krishna Dubaka, who will be available to help answer any technical questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. So with that, Tony, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dennis. So first, to try to make this webinar as useful as possible for everyone, we'd like everyone to answer a couple quick questions about how you heard about this webinar and how familiar you are with Next Labs. Based on your responses, we'll try to make sure that this webinar is as useful as possible for all attendees. So you should have seen a poll interface pop up, and I'll just give everyone a little bit of time to answer those questions, and then we'll move on. Okay, let's get started. There are many challenges with export compliance, and one of the main ones is handling deemed exports. In addition to limiting events that constitute deemed exports, organizations need to also both detect activity that counts as a deemed export, as well as properly disclose any interactions that are deemed exports. Primary way to limit and be able to disclose deemed exports is by limiting access to controlled technical data. This would be any data that is associated with controlled products or controlled technologies that are subject to export restrictions. However, export restrictions can be complex, and compliance with those regulations is a complex and time-consuming process. The complexity of complying with export controls can make it hard for businesses who are trying to achieve their digital transformations or to make transitions to new technologies, whether that's systems or applications that they are using in their business. Throughout the process of compliance, one of the most important things is managing the balance between access to controlled technical data and maintaining business agility so that the organization can do what it needs to do commercially. Almost all countries have export regulations, and those regulations vary from country to country. In addition, the regulatory agencies tasked with enforcing those export regulations vary in scope and enforcement powers depending on the country they're operating in. Just within the United States, there are many regulatory regimes that organizations may need to comply with, depending on their line of business and the scope of their operations. Here are just a few of the most common regulatory regimes that we encounter within the United States and with our partners and customers. This is by no means an exhaustive list. As an example, chemical companies would also be regulated by CBC and CFATS. The key requirement of export control regulations is granular access to controlled data. This has four main components. First is that you know your data, where it is, and what it is classified as controlled technical data, or CTD. Second component is protecting the data where it's stored. And the third component is controlling the data when it is accessed. Finally, it's important to monitor and report on controlled technical data access for both internal and external audit purposes. The issue is that this granular access is beyond most applications' design capability and requires heavy customization. The end result is often a high number of security roles, a worse user experience, high cost of maintenance, and all of this without completely eliminating the exposure of sensitive data. This then opens up organizations to sanctions and fines. We believe that a key way to addressing all of these export control challenges and avoiding a lot of these negative results is to take a data-centric approach to automating export authorizations. What this means is that automated controls are used to protect data so that there isn't a manual step in the process. So some of the benefits of a data-centric approach to export controls include using attribute-based access controls to control access to the technical data exports. What this means is that automated controls are used to protect data so that there isn't a manual step in the process. This includes using attribute-based access control to control access to technical data exports and to automatically match technical data exports to export licenses or technical assistance agreements. This allows you to create information barriers around the projects, applications, and systems that need protecting to prevent the leakage of export-controlled technical data to users or to systems that are not authorized. You can also automatically detect user activity that would constitute a deemed export and automate the process of either approval or of documentation. This allows you to provide a full audit trail, not only of the activity on the system, but as well as what policies have been defined and when they have been enforced, so that you can show compliance of export controls to the relevant authorities. There are different types of attributes that can be used to enforce policies, to enforce export control regulations. There are user attributes, such as title, nationality, region, division, or other things specific to an individual user. There are environmental attributes, such as the location, geolocation of the systems, the time that the request is coming in, as well as the device where the request is originating, as well as the device on which the controlled asset may be stored. There are also research attributes, such as the data classification, the ECCN classification, as well as the application that's being used to store or access the data. And finally, based on all of those attributes, you can either restrict access to or enforce policies based on the action being performed, whether that's viewing, changing, updating, adding, removing, whatever is required. Here's another way of looking at the application of the export license enforcement policy. Here you can see that the user, the environment, and the resource attributes are being used, and it's the intersection of these with the export license policy that determines what users have access to. Only if all of these match against the export license policy would an access request be granted. Some of the most common attributes of export licenses that can be used to define these policies are who the licensee is, what country they're located in, if there's a sub-licensee or if they're and where that sub-licensee can be located, what type of material or asset is being controlled, and whether that's part families or it's the ECCN, the citizenships that allow access to such resources, whether an NDA has been assigned, and where the data or where the license can be used. Finally, the effective date and the expiration date for the license should be incorporated into the license enforcement policy. There are many different types of data resources that are covered by export control regulations. Here are just some of the many different types of resources that are involved in the life cycle of defense articles and are therefore covered by export control regulations. To validate a resource request against an export license attributes are mapped to user, environment, and resource attributes. Only if all of these match the values defined in the policy is access granted. Evaluation is done in real time at the time of the request so that any change in attribute values takes effect immediately. The final piece of export control compliance is monitoring the application of policies and how the data is being accessed. Regulatory compliance requires filing reports of export activities, and manually recording all export activities and verifying compliance can be extremely time-intensive. Automating the collection of this data and generation of a report eliminates much of the manual effort of reporting compliance. For example, the information usage can be monitored to understand who is really accessing the data and how it's being distributed. Can automatically detect any risky activities or red flags so these can be investigated in a more detailed manner. Reports can be generated to show auditors and regulators of the specific policies and how they're being enforced. And those reports can also be used for internal usage as well. And finally, having such data and having such reports provides a basis or a starting point for a gap analysis to figure out what policies may need to be changed in order to address any gaps between the desired export control policies and what exists in reality. Now I'll turn it over to Charles to go into some specific use cases and demos. Charles?
Welcome to a Next Labs demonstration of our abilities to control access to ITAR data through access controls. In this use case, we will focus on access control. In this scenario, Company X has a single global SAP system that controls the engineering, manufacturing, and distribution of both export control and non-export controlled parts. Access to the system is controlled according to the U.S. International Trade in Arms Export Control Regulations, otherwise known as ITAR. As you can see, we have four users: G. Ford, A. Lincoln, J. Carter, and Adam. As you can see, all four users have a variety of citizenships and reside in different locations, and only J. Carter has an export license. In this use case, all four of these users will go into an SAP Fiori application called Display Material and ask to see material FG129, which is classified as an ITAR material with the corresponding export license of IN2469 that is associated with it. The Next Labs policy that we will associate with this is a top level deny policy that has two top level exceptions. The first exception allows only US citizens within the US to access the file. The second being that anyone with a corresponding export license that matches that file will also have an exception. If someone does not meet either of these two requirements, they will be denied access to the file and will receive a user denied message. Now let's take a look with our first user, G. Ford. He is a US citizen and currently resides in a US location. We're going to enter the Fiori display app as G. Ford and request to view material FG129. As we can see, he is able to access it. The reason he is allowed access is because G. Ford is a US citizen in a US location and thus satisfies the first exception rule and policy that we set. Now, however, if we check with our second user, A. Lincoln, who is a British citizen that is currently residing in the United States, when he goes into SAP Fiori and requests access to FG129, he will receive a message denying him access. This is because A. Lincoln, in this case, is not a US citizen, despite residing in the United States. They do not satisfy either the first or the second exception rule, and thus will be denied access to the file. The third user, J. Carter, in this case, is an Indian citizen residing in India. However, they do have the export license IN2469, which is associated with the SAP material FG129. Thus, when J. Carter enters the SAP Fiori app and requests access to the FG129 file, they are allowed access because they satisfy the second exception rule, despite not being a US citizen or residing in the US. Now, Adam is a US citizen, however, they currently reside in Great Britain. So when they enter the Fiori app and request access to the file, they will also be denied access to FG129 despite being a US citizen. Because he is not located in the United States. It is worth noting, however, that if he was to go back to the United States, even just for a bit, he would satisfy the first requirement and thus have access to the data. This concludes this use case demo. Hello. In this demo, we will show you how to protect IP data and SAP DAM. In today's scenario, we will have two companies, companies A and companies B, that are coming together to form a joint venture, company JV. The IP from each company, as well as the joint venture, are stored in a shared SAP system and can be accessed by other transactions. The employees of companies A and B can view their own respective IP data as well as the IP of company JV, but the employees of company JV can only view their own company IP data. So how should we go about achieving this using NextLabs? The first steps we should take is classifying our documents and then designing policies around those tags to basically implement our own access controls. As you can see on the slide, we have 3 users: G4 with company A Lincoln with company B, and J Carter with company JV. Each of the companies have their respective security tags attached to them. Company A can view the IP data of companies A and JV. Companies B can view the IP data of companies B and JV. And company JV can only view the IP data of company JV. Now on the document side, we have 3 DIRs and their respective security documents attached to them. They have also been classified with their respective IP security tags: IPA, IPB, and IPJV. And so now to ensure these tags are actually attached to these documents, we're going to jump to the new transaction that NextLab provides for classifying your documents. This is the NextLab security classification data. Once you've installed NextLabs, you'll see this and be able to access the security classification maintenance transactions, where you can actually go and define your documents and attach the appropriate security tags to them. This is the NextLab security classification maintenance. But for the sake of the demo, I've already gone ahead and classified these documents with the appropriate tags, so we can be a bit more time sensitive. Now that the documents are classified and tagged in the SAP system, it's time to create policies with your access controls in place. What we see here is the NextLab's Control Center policy authoring tool. Now, we've designed a few policies with our given scenario in mind, so we have to set a top deny policy with the policy effect set as deny, and the resource components in scope are those that have been tagged as IPA, IPB, and IPJV. So when this policy is matched, it will display a user message that can be set here. So now if you look at the policy, we haven't set a subject resource, making this a blanket deny policy. As a best practice, NextLabs recommends having a top deny policy and setting a few exceptions for users able to access data. We tend to think we'll be denying more people than actually allowing to view our classified data. We will only be allowing a very few users. Now in our case, we have 3 users: G Ford, A Lincoln, and J Carter. And in order to allow the appropriate employees access to their respective IP data, we've written some exception policies here. One being to allow company A employees access to the documents with IPA and IPJV documents. So if you see, this is an allow policy set to only apply to employees of company A, meaning users such as G Ford would have access to documents from companies A and company JV. Now, because this is an allow policy, there's no need to set a user message. So the message section is left completely blank. Similarly, we have another policy set for company B, allowing them only to access documents and IP data from companies B and JV. And if you look at the policy set for company JV, it is set to only allow company JV employees to access their own respective IP data and not anything from companies A or companies B. Now that these policies are designed and deployed, we can see how they are in place in the SAP system. So our policies are designed and set as a top deny. We should be able to see the following results. The user G4 should only be able to access IP data from companies A and company JV, being the documents 203 and 205. But because 204 is under company B, they should not be able to access this. Now, we're going to check this in the system as well, just to ensure it's all working. As you can see, we're logged in as G4 now, and we're going to try to access document 203. which was tagged as IPA and should be accessible by people from company A. And as you can see, we are allowed access and can see all the data and document. Now let's check it with 204. Now, because it's under company B, we should not have access to it. And as you can see, we are not allowed access and we are given the deny message that we were set earlier. Now checking it with 205 under company JV, we are allowed access to it. Now we're going to check a similar thing with user A. Lincoln. Because he's an employee of company B, he should have access to all the IP data from companies B and JV. In this case being document 204 tagged in IPB and document 205 tagged as IPJV. Now let's check with all three documents again. We shouldn't have access to document 203 because that's tagged under company A. And as we try to access it, you can see that we're denied access. Now we should have access to documents 204 as that's under our own company B. And you can see that we do have access to that. Now let's try it with document 205. And we have access to that as well. Now, as we log in as J. Carter with company JV, we should only be able to access document 205, which is under IPJV. Now that we're logged in as J. Carter, let's check our access. First with 203. Still no access. Now let's check with 204. No access as well. Now we should have access to 205, which we do. The Next Labs Control Center platform also logs every attempt at activity to these classified documents, and this is available through the Next Labs tools. This is necessary when you're trying to prove your compliance with certain regulations and can be used in terms of audits and logs. This concludes the Next Labs IP data use case demo. Hi, in this demo we are going to take a look at how we can implement access controls for export control compliance in SAP ECC or S/4HANA systems using Next Labs. We are going to conceal the classification of data and materials in the SAP GTS system to enforce access controls in SAP ECC or the S4 systems. In this scenario, we have two users, a demo user 1 and a demo user 2, whose citizenships are in the United States and China respectively. We also have two materials, one classified under ITAR and one that is not classified. To demonstrate this use case, we will take an example of MMO3 transaction, but in principle, the access controls will work the same across the entire SAP landscape. Taking the example of the GTS system, I have an SAP S4 system as well as an SAP GTS system in the landscape, where the classification of materials is maintained, and they communicate with each other via an RFC, basically a remote function call. The Next Labs platform communicates via the standard HTTPS protocol and using the REST-based API. But now let's dive into the system and take a look at a basic sample policy that's designed to achieve export compliance. Okay, so here we have a top deny policy. It's set to deny access to ITAR's classified data in HECI 9. HECI 9 here is just our SAP or S4HANA system. As you can see here, the policy is a deny policy and the subject component is empty, meaning that this policy is applicable to all users across the SAP system. It will deny everyone. There is a resource component which says export security, which is ITAR. Basically, any classified material that is tagged as export security ITAR is going to be denied for all users because of this. We also maintain this data in different systems across which the policy is applicable. In this policy, we have two, HECI 9 and the GTS system. Now, here are some of the actions that users can try to execute in this transaction. And if the user is denied that action, you can set what the user message will be. That is maintained as an obligation in the policy here. Here we have it set to Next Labs, ITAR classified data, no authorization. As a best principle, the way we design policies is always a top deny policy followed by an allow exception. But who should we allow access to the data? We're going to allow access based on citizenship. We will set an allow policy, which is a subset of the deny policy. And it basically says that this policy is an allow policy. The subject component we're setting is citizenship status United States. So if the user's citizenship is from the US, they can access this data. We also need to add the SAP system in which this policy is applicable. Okay. Now that we've done that, what happens is if a request comes in, it's hit with that deny policy. But if they are a US citizen, and that deny is going to be overridden by the allow policy. In that way, only logged American citizens can access this ITAR classified data, which is going to help automate your export compliance. Now let's take a quick look at the SAP GTS system. So in SAP GTS and its maintained products, you can see that we have material RM223 here. That's going to be replicated from the S4 system. Also, its legal regulation classification is set under ITAR and the US munitions list. And it's number 1A005, which is also its ITAR classification number. Now let's jump to the S4 system, logging in as user A demo user 1. There we go, A demo user 1. Now we're going to try to access the master transaction. This is MO3. You can see I had the material number RM2231 here, and A demo user 1 has access here. We can see the data because, like we said, A demo user 1 is a US citizen. But now let's log in as A demo user 2, who, like we said, has Chinese citizenship. Now logging in. Let's try to access the same material. You see we're not allowed to see it, and we're getting the message from the Next Labs policy. Nextlar ITAR classified data. The same message we set earlier. The same message that we set. So now in this scenario, what has happened is this. When the user is trying to access the transaction MMO3 in the SAP S4HANA system, in real time, there's an RFC call that happens with SAP GTS. That's the classification of the requested material. So in our example, that classification was set to ITAR and the US munitions list. Those details are subjected to a policy controller check. That policy controller check then goes over the selected attributes, in this case citizenship, as well as the resource they're trying to access, making sure it's classified as ITAR. If both are correct and come back positive, the user is granted access. If it is classified as ITAR, however, and the citizenship is not US, such as when we tried to access it as demo user 2, they're going to be denied access and given the set user message. And that's exactly what happened. That concludes our demo with the GTS and S4HANA system. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. So that wraps up the content and demo portions of our webinar. Before we move into the Q&A section, we're just going to pause here again, ask a couple additional polling questions, just to get some feedback on the content of the webinar, whether it was useful, and then also we do want to go ahead and find out if you would be interested in having a follow-up call with Next Labs afterward to discuss our specific solutions. So the poll should be popped up now. So go ahead and answer that, and then we'll move on to the Q&A portion. After you've answered the poll questions, and if you do have questions that you'd like to ask, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A interface within the Zoom webinar interface. And we'll go ahead and start answering those in a minute. All right, so I think that we can move on to Q&A and type any questions that you have into the Q&A interface which is at the bottom of the screen. So so first question that we had, I think this is due to the demos showing mostly SAP. So question is whether this is primarily for SAP integrations or does it work with other systems? And the answer is that Next Labs products I think speak specifically to our DAE, Data Access Enforcer product. Both supports, we have a DAE for SAP, which supports integrations with SAP, but we also have products that will support any ODBC, JDBC databases, and many other big data applications. So the SAP ones are BW and HANA, Google BigQuery, Google Cloud, SQL, Amazon, RDS, DynamoDB, Redshift, Aurora, Tableau, and Microsoft Azure, Power BI, Azure Database, etc. So, yes. So the answer to the question is yes, we do support more than SAP, even though the examples that we showed today were on SAP systems. Pratap, Dennis, if you wanted to jump in and add any color to that, definitely feel free.
Yeah, sure, Tony. So we pretty much support both SAP and non-SAP systems, and our policy platform is now centralized policy platform, which can work with any non-SAP systems as well.
Yeah, it's a good point, and you can use the central policy platform for multiple systems. So you can define those policies centrally, and then they can be used in whether SAP or non-SAP systems. Okay. Just pausing here for any other questions. Maybe while we wait for any questions, Dennis or Pratap, if you have any specific things you've seen with some of our customers on export controls or from conversations that you may not have covered. Sorry to put you on the spot, but just know that since you've had more direct interactions with the customers on these, if there's anything in particular that jumps out, and how we encounter things in the wild, so to speak.
Right. This is Dennis. I think one of the things that we see quite often with customers is that when they're first sitting down and looking at the whole problem of export compliance, it almost seems impossible to tackle or totally insurmountable. And we've worked with many customers to develop methodologies and those methodologies really show them how to take it a step at a time. Okay, so you start with your most exposed or your most serious situation, address that first. And because of the way Next Labs works, once you have got a structure set up to approach the export control problem, that approach can be reused across all of your different systems. SAP is an example, or some of the Microsoft systems, or whether it's a system that's in AWS or a system that's in Azure or wherever it happens to be, we can use the same approach that we take to resolve the initial issue that you have to address all of the other issues in the organization. So it is a process that takes some time and needs to be done incrementally rather than what we call boiling the ocean. And we've been very, very successful with that.
Thanks, Dennis. Let's see. So we got a question here about how much effort and timeline does it require for implementation? I think that's, some of that depends on the specifics of the systems and specific use cases that are being implemented. But I would say as the actual implementation of a policy can be extremely quick. We actually have a DAE customer challenge that we offer to anyone who's looking and evaluating our software that will show you on a SaaS system how policies you can implement 2 or 3 use case policies in under an hour and see them live, see them active on a SaaS system. And that's something that Next Labs is happy to set up a meeting for and do that live for anyone who's interested in participating. For a full implementation on site, I know that we have just completed a deployment where it was, I believe it was under 8 weeks, if I'm remembering correctly, where from the initial planning of the implementation and deployment all the way to the go live date. So that was under 8 weeks is the time period for an on-premise deployment. I have another question here. So can one NextLab Solutions instance be centrally used to integrate with multiple SAP GTS systems within an MNC for export controls of different countries, regions, jurisdictions? I believe the answer is yes, but I'll also defer to Pratap to provide more details on that.
Yeah, that's correct, Tony. So we can have our NextLabs policy platform centrally managed and work with multiple SAP instances. We have flexible configuration, which SAP systems that you want to turn it on for the policy evaluation, which systems you cannot or you don't want to use, and we can also have an option of phase-wise rolling out, adding incrementally the number of SAP systems. Yes, so it is supported.
Great, thanks, Pratap. I think it was a follow-up question. Is this a cloud solution? Quick answer is that it's available both on-premise or as a SaaS product. And there's some considerations in play. There is, well, maybe Pratap, I can let you just talk about some of the technical considerations, because I know that there are certain reasons why you might want to have components of the solution closer or on premise to the database.
Yeah, sure, Tony. Yeah, you're right. So we have both options, on-prem and cloud solutions. So depending on how your current, the environment setup is there, so we can work together with it. So we also have the hybrid options, where our the policy platform can be on cloud, and if your SAP instances are on-prem, so we have the option to set it up to work in a hybrid environment as well.
Thanks, Pratap. All right, just giving a couple more minutes while we wait to see if there's any more questions. I do want to reiterate what Dennis mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, that this is going to be recorded. You'll be getting an email with a link to the recording as soon as it's up and online, probably later today. And you can definitely share that with anyone that you think would find useful. I would also, we will be following up depending on whether you indicated an interest in talking with Next Labs. We will be following up with you, so expect to hear from somebody by the end of the week or early next week, just following up on that as well. Question is, what is the licensing structure? Um, Dennis, yeah, or Pratap, yeah, if you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, typically the licensing is now based on the users, the number of users, and then again, it depends on the type of number of systems that you're looking. But again, so it starts with the user-based license.
And it can also be done as a subscription, a single year or multi-year subscription, or it can be done as an outright purchase, which would then require an annual maintenance contract. And we can provide, if you want to follow up, Manash, with us, we can provide more details on that from our sales team.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Pratap. And Manash, yes, we will follow up with you. All right, with that, I see no remaining open questions. So I would just like to say thanks once again. Oh, wait. One question getting in just under the wire. So what are the different export control solutions from NextLabs? I think most of our products can apply in some ways to export controls, but we have DAE, which is our data access enforcer, which sits at the data access layer and enforces policies when data is being accessed, regardless of the applications being used. We have SAP DAM, which is obviously used with SAP for enforcing policies within the application. We have a product called Sky DRM, which is used for controlling sharing of content. Dennis, I see that you've unmuted, so you probably
yeah. One of the things also to keep in mind, Sonny, about this situation is that with attribute-based access control, you can control access to any system for any reason. Okay. Export control is just one type of access, but as Tony showed in the demo, one of the things that we often address are things like intellectual property and other things like that. So, you may have a contract with one of your customers that their intellectual property data that you import into your systems to use, for instance, to manufacture something for them or something like that, can only be viewed by certain people. I'm thinking of a customer that we have that manufactures similar items for multiple different customers, but each of those items is manufactured on a different assembly line using slightly different variations on their intellectual properties that are specific to each of those customers. And they have very strict rules about sharing that data among the engineering teams who work on the various customer accounts. And so NextLabs is useful for that kind of control, as well as for any kind of export control scheme, because all you're doing, as you saw when we demonstrated the policies, was the policies are evaluating attributes. And the attributes, if the attributes are defining export controls, then the policies will govern export control access. If the attributes are identifying intellectual property, then we will govern intellectual property access, or it may be a combination of all of these things. So the real beauty of NextLabs is that a NextLabs solution can be applied, because we use attribute-based access control, can be applied to any type of a situation that you can describe with attributes. And as you saw in the demos, the attributes revolve around the users, around the data, and then around the context in which the user is accessing the data. And we can provide more details on that in a follow-up meeting.
Thanks, Dennis. All right. I don't see. Let's see. We've got another question. Are the attributes set by the GTS or set by NextLabs?
Yeah, so the attributes, we could consume, if it is explicit attributes by GTS, I mean, like, if any information that we could directly use, if it is available in the GTS system. If not, I mean, from the next labs also, we can classify like the way in one of the use case that we have shown, or we could consume from any non-SAP system as well. So the attributes, can be consumed from variety of sources, not necessarily from SAP or from GTS, even from external also. So we basically, rely on any attributes using which we can, like, just enforce the policy for export control.
Thanks, Pratap. All right. Last opportunity. But if I see no more questions, then I'd like to say thanks once again to everybody for joining us today. Expect to get the emails with the link to the recording, as well as if you indicate an interest in hearing from us and scheduling a meeting, someone will be in contact with you shortly. So thanks again.